On a humid afternoon in April 1971, a man named Jack Cowin stepped off a plane in Sydney with a Canadian accent. A fresh business degree and an idea borrowed from a chain he'd seen exploding across North America. He was 28 years old. He had convinced a group of Canadian investors to back him on a hunch that Australians, who in 1971 ate their hamburgers wrapped in beetroot and pineapple at corner milk bars, were ready for something faster, glossier, American. What Cowin did not yet know, as he caught a taxi from Mascot into the city, was that the name he was planning to bring with him, Burger King, was already taken, not by a rival fast food empire, not by a corporate giant, by a small takeaway shop in Adelaide run by a man most Australians had never heard of who had quietly registered the trademark years earlier. That single clerical fact, buried in a South Australian filing cabinet, would shape the next 50 years of Australian fast food. Force, one of the most powerful brands on earth to operate under a name nobody outside the country recognizes, turn a backup option into one of the most successful franchise stories in Australian commercial history. This is how a trademark accident in Adelaide became a billion-dollar brand called Hungry Jack's. To understand what happened, you have to start with Jack Cowin himself. He had grown up in London, Ontario, the son of a businessman, and after finishing university, he sold life insurance door to door across small Canadian towns. It was unglamorous work, but it taught him something he would later say was the most important lesson of his career, that most people say no. And the entire game is finding the few who say yes. By the late 1960s, he had watched McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken transform American eating habits, and he became convinced that the same revolution was about to cross the Pacific. Australia in 1969 had a population of just over 12.5 million, a growing middle class, suburban sprawl pushing out from every capital city, and almost no organized fast food infrastructure. Cowin saw a vacuum. He raised around $10,000 of his own money, convinced 30 Canadian investors to contribute the rest, approached the Miami-based Burger King Corporation about acquiring the Australian master franchise rights. Burger King at the time was owned by the Pillsbury Company, the American flour and food conglomerate. Pillsbury said yes. Cowin had his deal. He had his capital. He had his suppliers lined up. What he didn't have, when his lawyers in Adelaide ran the trademark check in early 1971, was the name. A takeaway shop in the Adelaide suburb of Burnside, owned by a man named Don Dervin, had registered Burger King as a business name in South Australia in the late 1960s. It was a tiny operation, a single location selling burgers and chips to locals, but the registration was legitimate. It was active, and under Australian trademark law, it had primacy within the state. The American giant could not legally open a single restaurant in Australia under its own name without infringing on a small suburban shopkeeper's registered mark. Cowin had two options. He could fight the registration in court, spending years and tens of thousands of dollars on a case he might lose, or he could choose another name. He chose another name. He went back to the Burger King Corporation in Miami and asked them to supply a list of trademarks they already owned but were not actively using. The Americans sent him a short list of names sitting dormant in their files, names that had been registered defensively, or for old product lines, or for ideas that had never made it to market. One of those names was Hungry Jack. It had been used briefly in the United States as the brand of a pancake mix owned by Pillsbury. The name was available. It had a folksy, slightly larrikin feel that Cowin thought would translate to Australia. He added a possessive apostrophe-s, making it Hungry Jack's, and on the 18th of April 1971, the first store opened on Bennetts Road in Innaloo, a suburb of Perth. The choice of Perth was deliberate. Cowin wanted to launch far away from the established food markets of Sydney and Melbourne, in a city where mistakes would be cheaper and where he could refine the operation before scaling east. The Innaloo store sold burgers, fries, milkshakes, and the unmistakable flame-grilled Whopper, identical in every respect to the Burger King product sold in Miami. Detroit, except for the logo on the wall and the name on the receipt. Western Australians did not particularly care what the place was called. The food was novel, the service was fast, the prices were reasonable, and the queues started forming almost immediately. Within 2 years, Cowin had opened additional stores across Perth. By the late 1970s, Hungry Jack's had pushed into South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, opening dozens of locations. beginning to challenge McDonald's, which had arrived in Australia in 1971, just a few months after Cowin's first store. The 1980s were Hungry Jack's golden run. Cowin's company, which he had named Competitive Foods Australia, expanded aggressively with stores in shopping centers, on highway strips, in suburban high streets across the country. By 1990, there were more than 150 Hungry Jack's locations nationwide. Annual revenues exceeded $200 million. The Whopper had become a recognized icon of Australian fast food. The jingle, "The burgers are better at Hungry Jack's," became one of the most successfully embedded advertising hooks in Australian broadcast history, written by the agency Mojo and aired relentlessly across television and radio. Cowin had taken a clerical accident, a forced rebrand, and turned it into a national identity. The brand was no longer a workaround, it was the thing itself. But somewhere in the late 1990s, the relationship between Cowin and his American licensors began to fray. Burger King Corporation in Miami had watched Hungry Jack's flourish for nearly 3 decades under a name they had given away almost as a favor. The American executives wanted more. They wanted the Burger King name on Australian stores. They wanted royalties restructured. They wanted, in some accounts, to reclaim the territory entirely. In 1996, Burger King Corporation began opening stores in Australia under its own name, the Adelaide trademark held by Don Dervin having lapsed in the intervening years, directly competing with the Hungry Jack's network that Cowin had built. By 1999, there were Burger King outlets and Hungry Jack's outlets operating in the same shopping centers, often within a few hundred meters of each other, selling identical products under different signs. It was a commercial absurdity. It was also a legal time bomb. Cowin sued. The case, formerly known as Hungry Jack's Pti Limited versus Burger King Corporation, was filed in the New South Wales Supreme Court in the late 1990s. Became one of the most closely watched commercial disputes in Australian legal history. Cowin's argument was straightforward that Burger King had breached the franchise agreement by deliberately interfering with Hungry Jack's expansion, withholding approvals for new stores, in trying to engineer a default that would let the American parent reclaim the master franchise. In 2001, Justice Rolfe of the New South Wales Supreme Court ruled almost entirely in Cowin's favor. Awarding damages and finding that Burger King had acted in bad faith, the decision was upheld on appeal. Hungry Jack's was awarded approximately $71 million, a figure that at the time stood as one of the largest commercial judgments in Australian corporate history. More importantly, Cowin retained the master franchise. The American Burger King stores were either closed or converted. By 2003, every Burger King in Australia was once again a Hungry Jack's. The brand that had been forced on Cowin in 1971 by a small Adelaide takeaway shop was now, legally and commercially, the only flame-grilled burger chain in the country owned by the wider Burger King family. The reckoning, though, was not just legal, it was cultural. By the early 2000s, Hungry Jack's had become something stranger than a franchise. It had become a piece of Australian identity. Surveys conducted by Roy Morgan Research in the mid-2000s consistently showed that Australians considered Hungry Jack's a domestic brand, often unaware that it was the local face of an American multinational. The jingle, the red and yellow signage, the slightly daggy advertising tone, the cricket sponsorships, the Shapes and Whopper meal deals, all of it had been built around an Australian sensibility that the global Burger King brand could never have replicated. When American tourists arrived in Sydney or Melbourne in the 2010s and saw the Hungry Jack's logo for the first time, they were confused. The crown was the same, the Whopper was the same. The font was suspiciously familiar, but the name was completely foreign. That confusion, that small moment of recognition followed by puzzlement, became the most accidentally effective branding asset Burger King has ever owned anywhere on Earth. Jack Cowin, meanwhile, kept building. He used the cash flow from Hungry Jack's to invest in dozens of other ventures: Domino's Pizza in Australia, KFC franchises across multiple states, the meat processing company Competitive Foods, agricultural holdings, Media Stakes, and a long friendship with the late Kerry Packer that put him on the board of Channel 9 inside the inner circle of Australian commercial aristocracy. By the time the Australian Financial Review compiled its rich list in 2023, Cowin's net worth was estimated at more than $3 billion, making him one of the wealthiest self-made businessmen in the country. He had arrived in Sydney in 1971 with $10,000 and a name he couldn't use. He had built an empire on the substitute. There is a study worth mentioning here because it explains why the Hungry Jack's outcome was not just luck. In 2017, researchers at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics, led by Professor Mark Ritson, published an analysis of brand localization in Australian fast food markets. The finding was specific. Brands that adapted their names, their advertising tone, and their menu offerings to local sensibilities outperformed brands that tried to import their global identity directly by margins of 15% to 30% in market share over 2 0-year horizons. McDonald's succeeded in Australia by becoming Macca's in the public vernacular, leaning into the nickname, even officially renaming some stores Macca's during the 2013 Australia Day promotion. Hungry Jack's succeeded by never being Burger King in the first place. The accident of 1971 had given Cowin a head start that no amount of brand investment could have purchased. The broader pattern is one that recurs across Australian commercial history. The country is small enough, geographically isolated enough, and culturally distinct enough that imported brands cannot simply land and dominate. They have to be translated, often by a single ambitious operator who reads the local market better than the global parent ever could. Frank Lowy did it with Westfield by adapting American shopping mall design to Australian suburban density. Solomon Lew did it with apparel franchises. Jerry Harvey did it with retail electronics. The pattern is always the same. A local operator takes a foreign idea, files off the parts that don't fit, adds the parts that do, and ends up owning a market that the original brand could never have captured on its own. Hungry Jack's is the purest example of the formula, because it was not just adapted, it was renamed, repackaged, and rebuilt from the trademark up. What happens next is the question Cowin himself has been asked repeatedly in recent years. He is in his ADS now. The Burger King Corporation, now owned by the Brazilian-American investment firm Restaurant Brands International, has shown periodic interest in reacquiring the Australian master franchise. Cowin has so far declined to sell. In interviews with the Australian Financial Review and on the In Good Company podcast in 2022, he indicated that the business would likely pass to his family or to a managed trust, with no immediate plans to unwind the Hungry Jack's brand. The chain now operates more than 400 stores across Australia. It employs over 19,000 people. Annual revenues are estimated by IBISWorld at approximately $1.5 billion. The trademark dispute that started it all, the small Adelaide takeaway that forced the rebrand, has long since faded into commercial folklore. Don Dervin, the Burnside shopkeeper, is rarely mentioned in any official Burger King history, despite being arguably the most consequential figure in the chain's Australian story. Back to that humid afternoon in April 1971, when Jack Cowin stepped off the plane in Sydney with a name he was about to lose and a plan he was about to rewrite. He did not know, as he caught his taxi into the city, that the obstacle waiting for him in an Adelaide filing cabinet would turn out to be the greatest commercial gift he would ever receive. The Hungry Jack's story is not really a story about fast food. It is a story about how Australia quietly forces every foreign brand to become something else before it can succeed here, a country small enough to insist on its own vocabulary, and stubborn enough to make a global giant operate under a pancake mix name for 50 years. The same dynamic is playing out right now in retail, in streaming, in banking, in supermarket aisles where Aldi has rewritten the entire German playbook to fit the suburbs of Brisbane and Geelong. There is a reason Costco took 15 years to find its footing here, and a reason Amazon still hasn't fully cracked the grocery market. The pattern Cowin stumbled into in 1971 is the same pattern that decides which foreign giants survive in Australia and which ones quietly retreat. The question is, which brand will be the next one forced to choose a new name? Who will be the next Jack Cowin waiting at the airport, ready to build an empire out of someone else's mistake? Consider what almost happened in the years immediately after Cowin's arrival, because the margins were thinner than the eventual success story suggests. By 1973, only 2 years into operation, Hungry Jack's had opened just 4 stores across Perth. The Western Australian market was not exactly clamoring for flame-grilled American hamburgers. McDonald's had landed in Yagoona in suburban Sydney on the 14th of December 1971, beating Cowin to the eastern seaboard by a matter of months, and they were expanding aggressively with a war chest that dwarfed anything Cowin could muster. Industry observers at the time, including a widely circulated piece in the Bulletin in 1974, openly predicted that the smaller chain would be swallowed or shuttered within 5 years. Cowin himself later admitted in a 2018 interview with the Australian Financial Review that he had personally guaranteed loans against his Vancouver family home, and that 2 of his original investors had pulled out by 1975, convinced the venture was finished. What saved Hungry Jack's was not marketing brilliance or superior burgers. It was geography and patience. Perth, isolated by 2,000 kilometers of desert from the nearest major Australian city, gave Cowin a protected laboratory. He could make mistakes in Karrinyup or Morley without a Sydney journalist ever noticing. He tested menu items, refined supply chains, trained managers, and slowly built a regional dominance that became unassailable. By 1981, when the chain finally crossed into Queensland, Hungry Jack's had 36 stores and a logistics network that rivaled any quick-service operator in the country. The Whopper, priced at $1.45 in 1980, was outselling the Big Mac in every Western Australian postcode where the two competed directly. There is a counter-argument worth airing here, one that defenders of pure global branding often raise. They point to Coca-Cola, to Toyota, to Nike, brands that arrived in Australia and never changed a syllable of their identity and still conquered the market. Why did Burger King need a costume when these others did not? The answer lies in the timing of registration, the specificity of trademark law, the particular vulnerability of a brand that arrives second to a domestic operator who got there first with the paperwork,